Today, we're going to look at gender in the 20th century, changing ideas in masculinity and in femininity, as challenges of the modern era make people question traditional gender roles. It's important to keep in mind that as we move into the 20th century, America was changing. Once a country where the majority of people lived on farms or in the countryside, by the turn of the century, in fact several decades before the turn of the century, there were more people living in cities than in the country. And by the 20th century, large urban centers had populations of well over 1 million people. Urbanization changed the way people lived. They had closer neighbors. They could no longer be self-subsistent, having gardens and having livestock. They traveled to work, and it fundamentally changed the nature of family. On a farm, everyone lived and worked in the home. The home was the center not only of family life, but of economic life as well. In a new urban household where family members left the house to work for wages, work and home were further separated. Immigration also brought challenges as new groups of people from a variety of countries brought their ideas about masculinity and femininity into the nation. Industrialization is a change very closely connected to urbanization. The idea of industrial workforce, men and women working for wages and being paid by hour, rather than working on tasks and being paid by what they sell, is a major change in American history. It certainly changed the American family as it removed paid work from the home, offered opportunities for women to work in industries like textiles and paper, offered inducements for children to enter into labor, and therefore challenged the family economy and the nature of the household. Last but not least, changes in technology were affecting Americans on every level. Streetcars and trains and eventually automobiles changed where people could live and how they were transported. In the home, new appliances like refrigerators and mixers and washing machines changed the nature of women's tasks. There was also a rise in consumerism as more and more people bought items rather than making them themselves. Clothing could be bought off the rack, canned food made items available without as much preparation, and consumerism therefore changed the job of the housekeeper, and they changed the attitude of Americans who started to buy and recognize national brands. On the part of men, there were a lot of challenges to masculinity. Traditionally in America, American men had counted on the frontier, on the idea that there was a place that they could go and prove themselves to prove their masculinity. Traditional American stories, even myths, talk about men on the frontier fighting beasts, killing Indians, engaging in battle, and proving their masculinity. Throughout the 19th century, opportunities for this kind of presented themselves. But as American men moved into the 20th century, they were less likely to be on the frontier fighting bear or killing Indians, and much more likely to be sitting at a desk and living in a city. This created a crisis in masculinity. Adding to that crisis was the female takeover of two areas that used to be dominated by men, the home and religion. In terms of the home, so long as paid work remained in the home, father was the head of the household. Certainly in colonial America, though wives were responsible for cooking and cleaning and household management, the home itself was a male purview. The same was true of colonial religion, where father was the head of the household. As we moved into the Victorian era, though, and the spheres became separated, women held on to the home, its economy, and its management. And they also gained power over religion, as many viewed women as more religious and as better teachers for children in that area. Men then were left with the outside world. But many found that the office was not a frontier. It was not physically challenging, and it often offered very little emotional outlet that religion had previously provided. There was an overall fear that life was getting soft, that American men simply weren't challenged, and that masculinity was not all that it used to be. As a result, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we see a variety of solutions to create alternative expressions of masculinity. Some of those were military. We think of the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charging into battle, attempting to find a new place to prove their masculinity. World War I was also viewed by many, and large numbers of men volunteered for that war, believing that it was their opportunity to prove themselves as their fathers had in earlier conflicts. On the religious front, we see the creation of many fraternal organizations, groups like the Masons, that focused on secret religious principle and allowed men, and men only, to get together and celebrate religious beliefs and values outside of the purview of women. There were other alternatives to masculinity as well. It was no coincidence that this was the period in which the Boy Scouts were created, to allow young men a chance to go out and face nature. There were also Tarzan books and other publications that suggested man in his natural circumstance facing the world. Efforts were made to shore up masculinity. Femininity had its own challenges as well, particularly in the area of sexuality. With urban growth, the ability of men and women to meet up and spend time together unchaperoned became a new specter on the horizon. Women started to court earlier. In an earlier time, when men and women dated, and it was called courting, they would be closely supervised by chaperones, who would limit the time the couple spent together and keep it in the household under a watchful eye. Increased high school attendance rates changed that, as boys and girls got to socialize in these public school settings, attending sporting events, going to dances, taking classes together, and having time that, though still supervised, was far less supervised than the family's parlor. Automobiles also changed the culture, as young men and women could get off together privately in an automobile, and this allowed for more private time and therefore an increase in petting, in attending movies, and in youth time over family time. There were also changing expectations about marriage and sex. The idea of marriage for love and a companionate marriage was becoming more popular. It was featured in novels and movies and in advertising campaigns. There was the hope that marriage could be about mutual enjoyment and satisfaction and even pleasure. And the idea that sex was not just for procreation, but was to cement a husband and wife together became popular and was encouraged in the media and by advice manuals on how to keep your marriage together and to keep your marriage fresh. As men and women had new expectations then, we see a rise in sexual activity within committed relationships. Conversely, we see a drop in prostitution rates as men have access to more women within their own class for sexual relations. We find them paying for sex less often, a clear indication that sex was more available within relationships than it had been in previous eras. With that said, we want to remember that for many people, life remained unchanged, particularly in the South, for poor individuals who owned no cars and had no money to go to the movies, for minorities like African Americans who felt it an issue of racial pride to preserve their dignity. Older systems stayed in place. Chaperones, sexual limitations, traditional ideas about dating, courtship, and marriage held on much longer in small towns than they did in urban settings. There was a rise as well in the interest in birth control. Contraception, the idea of allowing for sex for non-procreative reasons, remained controversial. Indeed, the Comstock Law, passed in the nation, prohibited the importation, mailing, and interstate shipment of contraceptive information and devices. This meant even married couples could not purchase contraception, and even physicians could not offer advice about reducing family size. Nonetheless, with population, urban, and industrial growth, contraception was on many people's minds. Poor families frequently protested that they simply couldn't afford to take care of all the children they were producing, but they lacked options. Margaret Sanger, often known as the mother of the birth control movement, wrote in the 1920s and 1930s of receiving heartbreaking letters from poor wives who could not control their husbands and their sexual appetites, but who simply could not afford physically or financially to have any more children, and who were begging for access for contraception information within their marriages. The modern birth control movement was born. It was a movement that advocated the availability of birth control, particularly in marital settings, and particularly through private physicians, so that married men and women could choose how many children they had while engaging in a companionate marriage. Eventually, Margaret Sanger also began to encourage eugenics. Eugenics was a scientific movement that suggested that it made sense to limit the reproduction of individuals that the movement viewed as lesser. In other words, poor people, people with mental disabilities, people of certain minority groups should be encouraged to not reproduce. There was a great fear in the United States that there were too many lesser people reproducing and not as many people of the right sort. The eugenics movement held festivals and fairs to celebrate blonde-haired, blue-eyed, all-American children. They also pushed for the sterilization or limited conception of lesser groups, particularly amongst the mentally ill. All this movement and interest in birth control is yet another indication that there were changing ideas about sexuality for both men and women in American life.